This is One More Dungeon 2. This game is a first-person roguelite dungeon crawler, and it has just very recently came out of early access for its big successful 1.0 launch. So I figured now would actually be a pretty good time to take a look at it, considering it is basically content complete and is ready to go, so here we are. The basic premise is that you are a human, just a mysterious random person, and you are at the bidding of these sentient snails, intelligent snails that have decided that they are going to imprison you, a king snail specifically, and put you through these various floors of this dungeon in order to get to the end to actually win your freedom. So that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to please these sentient snails and gain your freedom. It's a cute idea, and in fact was actually a fairly surprising amount of background lore that you can discover. It's something you might not really think would be the case. You might think it's kind of like a little throwaway plot, but actually there's little journal entries and things you can find that tell the backstory of how this actually came to be, and it's kind of funny that they put that much effort into what is kind of a very silly premise, you know? I do appreciate effort being put into premises like this because it just makes them even more enjoyable, in my opinion, when they sort of go out of their way to justify the silliness in some way. So the first thing to talk about, of course, is the art style. It has a very nicely unified, very colorful art style, lots of glowy effects, and even simple things like the fire effects and things are very glowy and bright. And you of course have magic staves and things a lot of the times, and those are very glowy. So yes, everything glows in this game, even the enemy corpses glow. And the whole game has this, I'm not 100% sure what to call the art style, but it kind of makes everything look like a toy, sort of. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, that's clearly what they're going for. Everything has this, almost plasticky sheen to it. The enemies are very silly looking and quite cute oftentimes, especially the slimes. The slimes are adorable. Although some of the enemies later on get genuinely unsettling looking. They're actually kind of creepy. I think it's the eyes. There are several enemies later that have really creepy eyes, and they're kind of juxtaposed against the, colorful, cute exterior of everything else. Kind of gives you this nice feeling of unsettling, what is that? And all of the weapons and artifacts and just pieces of gear and things that you're going to be finding for yourself have this very exaggerated fantasy aesthetic that again kind of makes everything look like a toy version of itself, which I mean is nice because the whole game looks like that. If only your weapons looked like that and everything else was super realistic, then I might have a problem with it, but in this case everything has this very unified, somewhat plasticky, very exaggerated cartoony art style, and I think it actually fits the game quite well. Gameplay-wise, it is a first-person roguelite, so you are, of course, going to be crawling through various randomly generated dungeons, fighting lots of enemies, and there are a couple of main methods of combat. First of all, you have your melee combat, because you will almost always have a melee weapon of some kind. Depending on what class you're playing, you've got a dagger, or a sword, or a mace, or there are various different things you could have, and it's actually bound to right-click, interestingly enough. By default, you can change this, of course, but the right hand is right-click and the left hand is left-click, which makes sense on paper, but almost every game ever that's first-person does it the other way around, right? So I find it kind of interesting that that's the default control scheme. It's not really a problem, it's just something I noticed that was kind of interesting. But yeah, so you just right-click to attack, and you can hold right-click to charge up a power attack that's a little bit different for each weapon. Some weapons simply do more damage, some can push enemies back or stun them or have other elemental effects and things, but charge attacks take energy, which is that blue gauge up in the top left in between the red and purple ones. And energy does not regenerate on its own, so you have to actually use this as a careful resource and find things like energy potions and the like in order to actually refill it. Now, the weapons in your left hand will generally be ranged weapons, although not always. Sometimes they can be shields, but either way, whatever's in your left hand generally takes crystals, and the crystal system in this game kind of works like mana in something like Hexen, where there are 3 different colors, red, green, and blue. You can find them all around the dungeon in various places, usually in bags of shards, and these crystals are consumed in different amounts by different attacks to do various things. So you might have an ice staff that uses 5 blue crystals, or a big meteor staff that uses 8 red crystals per attack, and things like that. So you'd have to be careful about these because the crystals are not extremely common. I mean, you do find them relatively everywhere, but you find them in kind of small amounts, you know, so you're never going to have hundreds and hundreds of every kind, except for if you don't have a staff or a weapon of that kind, so you're just building them all up, and only the staff of the kind that you have will be low, but you know, that's how it works sometimes. And ranged combat in this game is a simple affair, just point and click, but it's also very powerful because ranged weapons tend to do quite a bit of damage. They do damage relatively quickly, and enemies in this game hit for a lot of damage in melee. So you ideally want to stay away from them if you can as much as possible, so ranged attacks are sort of your out when it comes to dealing with tough enemies. They are the main thing that you're going to want to save for elite enemies and certain enemies that you have problems with in melee because you just have a hard time dodging their attacks and things like that, then of course for bosses as well. So this means that the crystal resources that you're actually gaining become very important because they become your sort of keys to get through difficult encounters. You can also find a couple of other types of equipment. You can find armor, which can protect you from different elements, or protect you from physical damage in general, or protect you from certain status effects. There are all sorts of various kinds of armors that you can find. You can, of course, only wear one of them at a time. You can also find relics, which equip to your Q key, and these cost a lot of energy at once to use, but they have powerful effects, like turning all of the corpses around you into gold, or summoning an explosive plant that blows up around enemies and things like that. They tend to be very useful, so you only find them occasionally. Generally in this other world you can transport yourself to occasionally, but we'll talk about that in a second. And you also have passive artifacts that you can find and equip. You have a certain number of slots for these, so you're encouraged to find kind of a specific build of them that works for you, since you can't just constantly stack them all up and equip as many as you find. You can only equip like 2 or 3 at a time on most characters at first. So these are also often found in that alternate dimension, but are sometimes found in secrets and things as well. They tend to be quite powerful, so they're definitely worth seeking out. You also will get bombs occasionally. Bombs are just a simple consumable explosive that does a good job at damaging enemies, but they're mostly used for blowing up statues and walls and things to find secrets and the like, so you mostly want to save them for accessing that sort of thing. As you kill enemies, and sometimes in various bits of clutter you can destroy and stuff, you'll find white crystals that pop out, and these are experience crystals. As you gather them up, your experience gauge will fill up, and once it's full, you'll level up and get a choice between 3 different passive perks that you can choose each level, and there are quite a few different ones you can find, from simple stuff like increasing the size of your inventory, or giving yourself another relic slot so you can equip more than 2 or 3, depending on the character you're playing. You can also do things like fully restoring your health if you're low, or maybe there'll be one to increase your physical resistance. Either way, they tend to be relatively useful. They're not as immediately powerful as finding like a big relic or something, obviously, but they add up to be very useful little passives, so you're encouraged to kill as many enemies as you can to gather up these levels to make yourself stronger. There are several different dungeon features that you'll be coming across as well. The dungeons work in a certain structure. There are 2 levels of a certain tile set, and then a boss of that area, and then you'll move on to 2 more levels of a new tile set, and then a boss there, and it keeps going like that. So you've got 2 dungeon levels, then a boss, and a switch to a new tile set, and every tile set has completely new enemies, new hazards, new looks for familiar things like chests and stuff. And sometimes you'll find all sorts of interesting things in the dungeons, like there'll be pits in the ground where you can actually throw items you don't need to get certain rewards, depending on the pit that generated. Sometimes it's health or energy, sometimes it's gold. You can also find things like secret walls that you can either blow up or hit, depending on the type of secret wall they are. Tables with certain things on them, like maps that reveal the whole map for that floor, or pieces of meat that you can eat to restore your health, or pieces of tainted meat that you can eat but will poison you, and actually you'll take more poison damage than the meat heals you, but if you have an antidote on you, then you can just get the healing and cure the poison immediately, so that's still useful. And sometimes you'll come across these rooms where there are all these like eyeballs on the walls and plants growing out of the ground and stuff, and these rooms have sort of a purple color scheme to them, and this is a sort of weird corrupted area that you can find. And in these rooms there will be these pillars that give you a curse if you let them see you for too long without destroying them. They will cause madness, which causes very difficult enemies to spawn for a while, so you really don't want that to happen. There are also these cursed jars in these areas that you can break that will increase your doom, which is that purple meter at the top left, and when your doom fills up, you get afflicted with a curse for the rest of your run, and the curses tend to be very debilitating, so ideally you do not want that to happen, although you occasionally will find these altars that allow you to cure one random curse, which is super nice when you find them. But yeah, so you can sort of decide whether or not it's worth breaking these, depending on how much doom you have built up, because some enemies' attacks will also inflict doom, and there are other ways to get it too, like sometimes you'll come across sarcophagi in certain rooms that you can open up for good loot, but these cause a lot of doom to build on you when you do so. And in these creepy purple rooms, there will also be a portal, and this portal frame will take you to an alternate dimension temporarily, and in this dimension it's sort of like a challenge level basically. It's usually a very small level that'll have something to it, like secret doors you can find, or a bunch of enemies to fight, or some platforming challenges to complete with lasers and platforms and things. It's different each time, but usually in these alternate dimensions there's really good loot, usually including a relic at the end if you can find it. So these are always worth going into, but once you use the portal to go back to the dungeon, the portal in that room will disappear, or will deactivate, so you can only go there once per floor, so you gotta make it count. Every time you die, you'll end up back at the castle with all of your snail friends, and you can explore the castle, and it actually is like a hub level. There are various different unlockable areas that this is your method of meta progression, basically. Every time you go through a run, you'll get some runes, and you'll be able to bring these runes back when you die, and you can spend these runes to expand your reach in this hub and unlock new stuff. You can unlock passives that improve all of your characters, you can unlock new classes to play as, you can unlock new passageways to explore new parts of the castle and get stuff for side quests, and unlock shop items and all sorts of things like that. So there's actually quite a lot of meta progression in this game, which I really like. These runes are used for all sorts of things, and it's actually really fun to explore the various bits of the castle outside of the dungeon because there's a lot to see. And unlocking new classes is one of the main functions of this, as well as unlocking portals that allow you to start at certain floors of the dungeon once you've beat a certain boss. So if you don't want to do those bosses again, you don't necessarily have to. And the classes are a pretty big deal because each of them is very different. They all have different starting statistics as well as different types of weapons that they can find, so their loot will change depending on which class you're playing. And each class also has an ultimate ability, an ult that's specific to them, and these tend to be very useful oftentimes, and they are quite powerful. So the Rage is what it's called, builds up in different ways depending on what class you're playing, and once it's full you can use this ult. Usually it's generally best saved for bosses and things, but it depends on what class you're playing. So the exact class you chose is actually pretty important because it's going to determine all of the loot that you find as well as the ultimate ability that you have access to. So this is all well and good and all pretty standard for a roguelite dungeon crawler. However, I do have a couple of problems with the game, honestly, some things that I'm not sure about. One is that the combat is kind of wonky, and it's a little bit difficult to describe, but especially the melee combat feels sort of weird because your swings are quite slow and delayed, and oftentimes you swing more times than you click for some reason. And enemy hitboxes are sort of odd. A lot of enemies have very wide hitboxes that reach a lot farther than you would expect, and it becomes very difficult to determine how to avoid taking damage. You do have a dash on all your characters, but it has a relatively long cooldown. For a dash anyway, it's like 2 or 2.5 seconds or something like that, and also it doesn't seem to give you any immunity frames. So you might find yourself in a situation where an enemy lunges at you, you dash to the left to avoid it, and you still get hit by like the side of its hitbox that extended farther to the side than the actual attack did, so you take damage anyway. And oftentimes I find that this game is a little bit too RNG dependent because of this. There are all sorts of really cool pieces of loot for you to find. Swords that freeze people, shields that shoot ice spikes when you block, meteor staves, and all kinds of cool stuff, but will you actually find any of it is the question. The game is very stingy with loot and with healing and stuff, and oftentimes you can go an entire run without finding anything exciting at all. Not only this, but enemies scale up in terms of the damage they do and the health they have very, very quickly, like much faster than you can keep up with. So by the time you're in like the second and third tile set, enemies can kill you in like 3 or 4 hits, and you take like 8 or 9 hits to kill them. And when you combine all this together, the sort of random gear, the overly spongy enemies, and the kind of disjointed hitboxes on a lot of enemies, you get a situation where oftentimes when you survive an encounter, it feels like luck rather than skill. It feels like you just kind of luckily evaded a bunch of weird hitboxes on a whole bunch of enemies, and then you killed them and you move on, and you don't really feel good about it, you know? Oftentimes the really tough encounters with lots of enemies don't feel like your skill matters that much. It feels more like you just have to get lucky enough not to intersect with all these weird hitboxes and just sort of flail your weapon until you hope they die before you. This really becomes more of a problem later on in the game because of the enemy scaling in terms of health and damage, and on the first floor the combat feels fine, it feels okay, the hitboxes are a little weird, but it's manageable. But as you get farther into the game it gets more and more frustratingly difficult, but not difficult for a good reason, right? It's difficult because you can't figure out how to not take constant damage from these enemies that can kill you in like 3 or 4 hits, and you have to wail on them forever to actually kill them, and I really don't like how the scaling works. Now sometimes you can get a really good run where you get a super great sword and a really cool staff, and you find a bunch of healing on the first floor, or you might not. I've had runs where I've gotten like 5 or 6 healing potions on one floor, and I've had runs where there's been no healing at all for like 2 straight floors, maybe like 1 piece of meat and that's it. It's very RNG dependent, I think too much, and when you mix in this much RNG dependence with a game with this kind of enemy scaling, it gets kind of frustrating. I've still had some fun with it. I don't think it's a bad game at all, but to be honest, I just think it's kind of fine. Like, it's average for the genre, you know what I mean? It doesn't do anything especially bad that makes me say it's a bad game and you should avoid it. I don't think that's the case, but it also doesn't do anything especially amazing that makes me say this is unique and this is why you should play it. It's just kind of fine. It's a very average game that doesn't really do anything to stand out, but also doesn't do anything specifically wrong. It does only cost $15, which is definitely a point in its favor because it definitely has at least that much worth of content in it for a roguelite dungeon crawler. I just think that this is a very crowded genre at this point, and I've played a whole bunch of them, and this one simply doesn't do any individual thing that is unique or interesting enough to make me say you should definitely seek this one out specifically. It's perfectly acceptable, it does an okay job with some questionable hitboxes and scaling, but it still does a good enough job at actually being an enjoyable dungeon crawler, so if that's what you're up for, then you could do a lot worse than to try it out. It just doesn't specifically enthuse me in any major way, you know what I mean? So if you want to check out the game, the Steam store page link will be in the description below this video. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.